And I think it's important sometimes not to separate it. What a client needs, though, is they need an advocate that is not going to become too emotionally involved in the case. But at the same time, they do not want someone that's going to be too detached. So it's striking that balance. I am able to empathize with my clients and make them feel as if I understand their plight.
Welcome back to another episode of Everyday Leadership, and today it's a pleasure just to be able to chop it up with my brother, who is a lawyer. He is a writer and a columnist for spaces like The Voice. He does a lot of work with anti-racism. He's normally snatching off edges on LinkedIn and just putting his thoughts out there in an unfiltered but enriching way, which I love to read. And he is a man of many, many talents that we're definitely going to delve into today. I have Terrence in the building. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I don't know who this man of many talents is. I don't know who he certainly isn't me. I just think. But yeah, it's a pleasure and an honour to be on your show today. So thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm done as online. I mean, like I said before we came on, it's been a couple of years, like going back and forth online in different spaces and places, having conversations. In fact, I think what's that thing called again? What was that everyone was going on during the pandemic? Clubhouse conversations. Like even in that space, we're in that space together for a minute. I forgot about Clubhouse. Right. Yeah. The name left my head. Yeah, man.
So yeah, Clubhouse.
So I always tend to, especially at the start, just peel it back a little bit and find out what was a young Terence like, because you seem to have lived the perfect dream of becoming a lawyer in a black household. So I'm curious, like, what was that young Terence about?
Well, let me tell you now. I am a pastor's kid. And
so what now?
Pastor's kid. My dad's, they call him Bishop. So you can imagine that growing up, I and my three siblings, my brother, my two sisters, I'm the youngest of four. We were brought up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So being in a Pentecostal household was very interesting experience. So a young Terrence was very much someone who was expected to be in Sunday school and evening service. Do I have to? Yes, we go in. Sunday school, evening service, very much. You can imagine that wind rush, and I know we like to use the term, and I suppose nowadays I'm going to be a bit more careful when I use the term wind rush. It's been bandied around a lot, but my parents came to the UK in the 60s. I believe my dad arrived in 1960, and my mum followed shortly afterwards. And there is that history, that Pentecostal tradition, where my father was a Sunday school teacher in his church in Jamaica, and he had an eye for one of his students in his class. And cut a long story short, after he moved to the UK, there was this epistolic communications, the second epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, but these were epistles from my dad to my mum, writing back and forth, and before you know it, they were married. And so we were brought up in that sort of very strict Pentecostal Christian type household. and it was very interesting. It had it had its moments, and I would say in terms of my childhood, I had an amazing childhood. It was one of the best periods of my life. Actually, was growing up as a child on the mean streets of West Bromwich in the Midlands near Birmingham. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So that was the start. The start was very much Pentecostal Christian, strict household, but lots and lots of fun, lots of interesting things were happening at that time. The political climate very much was, you can imagine growing up in the 70s and 80s was very much different to what it is now. So the climate was very, very, the political, economic, socio-economic as well. The climate was very different for us. But looking back, I look back with extremely fond memories. A childhood that I wouldn't change for the world, really.
Would you say that the background that you then had and being in that strict pastor's kid upbringing is what helped you navigate from the streets and not get caught up in that lifestyle, which was very easy to do?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things happened. The one main thing happened to me. I was brought up in West Bromwich, and I lived there until the age of about 12. And at that stage, prior to moving from West Bromwich to Burn-on-Trent, because my dad, he was asked to pastor a church, and so we had to move. And this was one of the most disappointing things that happened to me in my childhood at the age of 12, was to move from my established friends. So I had a group of friends primarily around a block, and it was 4 streets on that block. So you had Dartmouth Street, where we lived, number 38, so 30A, 30A Dartmouth Street. You had Grange Road, Edward Street and Lodge Road. So you had a block, literally a rectangle block, and my life revolved around that block. And round the corner you had, on Edward Street, you had Michael, you had Paul, Carty. Further up the road you had Andrew Howe. Round the corner on Lodge Road you had Junior Daly and the Dailies. These are all African Caribbean children. Around the corner at Grange Road you had Brian Davis. Around the other corner, in fact, same street, Dartmouth Street, you had George Whitmore. And so we had all these characters, and all these children in my group were young black men. When I say young black men, I mean black boys. You can imagine black boys growing up in the 70s. We moved from West Bromwich. I was aged 12. So we had the African Caribbean children. We had, and in my group, we had myself, Paul Foster, who didn't live around the block. We had Andrew Howe, Brian Davis, Paul Carty, Michael Carty, George Whitmore. I mean, I remember all the names like it was yesterday, because every single one of them was like a character out of some action movie. You know, it was incredible. And every one of them, we had a story to tell. So primarily, and I'm not sure how this happened, but primarily we galvanized as black boys. Now, why that happened, they say birds of a feather flock together. Now, why we all coalesced and grouped together. It's difficult to say. It's not like I didn't have white and Asian friends, but the core was a group of black boys, and we didn't agree that. We didn't say, "Oh, we're black. Let's." And I think many of us were brought up in the UK for whatever reason, like in a prison. You have the Aryan group on that side. You have the black group on that side. You have the Jewish group on that side. You have the Latinos. There is something that happens, right? And it's probably racism. Or you could say it's partly racism. You could say it's partly cultural. So there's all these things that, and they say birds of a feather flock together, and all these things push you together. And I've never, until I think this moment, asked myself, why is it that around the block where you have Asian, you have the Patels and the Singhs, because West Bromwich was primarily Indian, Southeast Indian, as opposed to Pakistani. You had white children, but when the chips were down, who was by your side? And it was black boys. So yes, inner city life was very, very black, and yes, I did have Asian friends, and you probably see a piece that I'm going to post on LinkedIn that relate to this. But the company that I kept, fundamentally, without any form of let's agree on this, let's agree to come together, were black boys. It's a phenomenon. African Caribbean, they were all Jamaican. We spoke a form of patois. It wasn't the real thing, it was diluted with a bit of a Brummie accent. We tried to emulate our parents. We thought we were speaking patois. Even till this day, I thought was I speaking patois? What was that? We all tried, because our parents were Jamaicans. They'd moved, they emigrated. They were part of that Windrush generation that came across. So they had their Jamaican accents, and we tried to emulate them. So that's the background. That is the beginning of the journey. You have the Pentecostal Christian. You have the streets as black boys. You have the question as to how did this happen? And I'm still trying to figure it out. And I think after this show, perhaps me and you will try and figure out how is it that little boys quickly know what their group is. I mean, this is phenomenon. It's a phenomenon.
Naturally gravitate to each other.
Yeah, and black girls with the black doll experiences. What happens to us? Why we recognize our tone? What happens? And it's not just tone; it's also cultural. So that's the background, and from that, and I think you've asked me a question, and I've taken too long to answer it. That's the background, and when I left to move to Burton-on-Trent, it was a very unhappy time for me, because I had to leave my core friends, and it may be that it was a good decision. I remember Mr. Gibbons telling me when we'd been falsely accused of vandalism, all the group, I think the 5 of us, had been falsely accused of vandalizing a telephone box. And the lollipop man reported us to school. You can imagine this white lollipop man with black boys, they must be guilty. So we got reported, and the headmaster, back in the day, you had corporal punishment, so we got caned for something we hadn't done. The phone was already cut when we got to the box. When we were trying to phone the girl of our dreams. I won't mention her name because she's still know her now. She might be embarrassed. We tried to phone the girl of our dreams to the phone box, only to find that the cord to the phone, we didn't have mobile phones then, the cord to the phone had been cut. And the lollipop man went, "Oh, you guys!" Before you know it, the next day we were in the headmaster's office being caned for something we hadn't done. And Mr. Gibbons, my teacher, said to me, and I'll never forget his words, this was probably, and this is, I'm not sure if this is ironic or not, but probably the most influential teacher that I've ever had was a white man called Mr. Gibbons, and I've posted about him on LinkedIn before, who pulled me to one side and said, "Terrence, if something like this ever happens again, don't get involved." Now, bearing in mind, we were totally innocent. The words from Mr. Gibbons, who was a brown, bearded, like, cardigan-wearing, sporty, you know, your favourite teacher that used to look like that back in the day, muscular-looking guy who was sensitive at the same time and believed in me, said, "Look, you know, those words resonated. Look, Terrence, in future, just don't get involved." And I think what he'd seen some promise in me. He'd always seen that promise. And yeah, those were the days.
Wow, it's interesting when you go back in time and you look at your upbringing, because it really does form a foundation as to who we become as we grow up. Because fast forward now, like I said, you're now a lawyer, and the work that you do is spent advocating for other people, just like the way that, I guess, some of the injustice that you felt as a youngster growing up, or even what Mr. Gibbons even told you, don't get involved. Now you do get involved, but you're like Mr. Gibbons for the people in your role, fighting for them. I mean, what does that feel like to go on that journey for you as a lawyer, especially as a black lawyer? Because there's still not that many of us in that profession.
Yeah. How does it feel to be a black lawyer fighting for justice? It feels an honor to be a lawyer fighting for justice. I still count it as a privilege to be able to make a difference. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, and I have the opportunity to pen powerful words that make a difference in people's lives through the pleadings that we serve, the documents, the papers you put in, the papers that we serve in litigation, in particular to do with claims against the police for all sorts of misconduct, from assault, wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, you name it. Some of it includes racist conduct, which I'm very happy to call out. I get frustrated at seeing. But the great thing about being a lawyer, particularly when I'm looking at black men, particularly young black men who are stopped and searched for no reason than the color of their skin, is the opportunity to try and right those wrongs. And clearly, empathy is not in short supply. It's not in short supply when I do this work, particularly when I'm representing black victims of police misconduct and brutality. Empathy is not in short supply. So it's an honor and a privilege.
Do you separate being a lawyer and being a black man, or do you see them as one thing?
Well, it's it's difficult to separate, and I think it's important sometimes not to separate it. What a client needs, though, is they need an advocate that is not going to become too emotionally involved in the case. But at the same time, they do not want someone that's going to be too detached. So it's striking that balance. I am able to empathize with my clients and make them feel as if I understand their plight. And I often say to my clients, yes, I was stopped on suspicion of drug dealing. And I say that by way of empathy. Now, I've never been assaulted by the police. I've never been put in handcuffs. I've had a couple of experiences to do with traffic stops. And in fact, all of my experiences, thank God, are related to traffic stops. So my experience with police stopping me on suspicion of dealing drugs was because I was in Catford, southeast London, driving a luxury car in an area, according to the police, that was known for drugs. And the reason why, or certainly the reason they gave for stopping me, was because I'd stopped my vehicle a couple of times. And they confidently said to me, we believe you're dealing drugs. But of course, as soon as I opened my mouth and said, please explain yourselves, the mission was swiftly aborted with, oh, we do, sir, you do understand that, well, you stopped your vehicle a couple of times, and this area is known for a lot of drug dealing. Now, what the officer failed to say was, well, this area is known for drug dealing by people that look like you, black people, black men like you, in this area dealing drugs. And what we do is we look out for black men like you, because most of you, must be true, most of you deal with drugs, don't you? Now, obviously, that's what they were thinking, but didn't say. Now, ironically, years later, a young man, and I posted about this young man, used to, in fact, not just used to, I think still lives in the area. He was stopped and strip searched in a bag. It wasn't an intimate search, just to take his trousers off, in handcuffs, extremely humiliating. And he's a young man that I represented, and this year, not too long ago, I think it was May, I settled his damages claim against the Metropolitan Police. I'm still waiting for a letter of regret, that they won't issue a letter of apology. They'll be able to just take the letter of regret and did something. And I used to take him to Sunday school. I used to pick him up in a Sunday school van, take him to Sunday school. Fast forward, I get stopped on suspicion of drug dealing. Fast forward, he gets stopped on suspicion of drug dealing as well. And I think that occurred in 2016. But that happened when I think he would have been around 22, 23. Mm-hmm. And his mother had the good presence, the presence of mind to record, because this happened directly outside the home. So he pulled up outside the home, and at that point he was physically manhandled, forced into handcuffs, forced into a police van, in tears. The van doors closed. Mum is recording all of this by now. And he later emerges doing up his trousers. And he's a young man that I used to pick up for Sunday school. I used to be Sunday school teacher. I used to pick him up for Sunday school. And he was so traumatized by the experience that he decided not to do it. And it was only 2020, with the death of George Floyd, that his mother said, no, that wrong has to be righted. That injustice has to be accounted for. And she contacted me and encouraged him to bring the case. And cut a long story short, we settled the case. I think it was May we settled the case. And remember, this happened in 2016. So it's taken all this time where he decided to put it behind him. And when I interviewed him, he was choking up. He was choking up because the trauma of that experience, the humiliation of, I've never been forced into handcuffs. I thank the Lord, I have never been forced into handcuffs and forced to strip and be innocent. I mean, if you're guilty of you know, you engaged in criminality, then you can deal with it better on the basis that it was justified. Whereas if you know that your color and the fact that you're young male is the reason, plus never helps if you're driving a BMW, then the trauma lingers. So in that case, I was able to say, not only I empathize with you, but I used to take his son to school, and I was stopped in that area. Thankfully, I wasn't assaulted. I wasn't forced into handcuffs and forced to strip.
How do you I'm going to use the word sane. I don't know the right word to you, but how do you stay sane when you're listening to all this different cases, when you're hearing all these different transgressions being done against people, both young men and young women? Like, how do you not go into that space and place of anger, annoyance, frustration, and that overwhelm you? Instead, you go into that place of, okay, what do we need to do to fight and to at least to get something out of this, and whether that might not be an apology, but at least we're going to get something out of it which validates that what they did was wrong. So how do you kind of stay in that space as opposed to the first one, which a lot of people would go into? When we listen to that case, you would get vexed, you'd be angry.
Well, I think there's two things, and we can use the analogy of perhaps an oncologist or a cardiologist to answer the question. And it's this: number one, you're a professional. So the first thing is you have to be professional to be able to do a good job for your clients. It's no good to my client if I am unable to do a good job because I'm so vexed I've taken my eye off the ball. That's not to say I can't be vexed. It's important to express anger, even as a professional. An oncologist seeing that the cancer has returned is not going to be cold. An oncologist seeing that the cancer has metastasized is not going to be clinical about that. Simply say, oh, by the way, yeah, the cancer has metastasized. There's not a lot we can do about it. You'll be dead in the next 3 months. Next patient. That's not going to happen, because an oncologist is someone you would expect to have, or a healthcare professional, clinician, is supposed to have, yes, professionalism, but also empathy. And a lawyer, likewise, is supposed to be a professional, to be able to do a professional job and not lose it, but also to be able to say, nah, man, that team wrong, It wrong my vex. And sometimes I speak to my clients in that way. If it's appropriate, I do speak to my clients. I do code switch. I enjoy it. I code switch, and I switch into whatever it needs to be. If it's Jamaican, if it's Jamaican patois, my poor example of Jamaican patois, I will pull it out. I'll pull it out, and I've got clients. I mean, I was speaking to a client this morning, and he's described in the expert psychiatry report as having dreadlocks, and he's Jamaican. And this is a claim against the Ministry of Defence for non-freezing cold injuries, and he's a client that called me up this morning at 7. I saw a missed call at 7. I mean, I didn't hear the phone because my phone's on silent. I wake up and I see a missed call at 7 in the morning. I'm like, there's a problem. When a client calls you at 7 in the morning, there's something wrong.
Serious.
There's struggling. There's something happening. Because I spoke to him the day before. So I spoke to him yesterday at length. And I then see a missed call after him sending him an email. So I called him up and I said, look, what's happening? And I have to take off my lawyer's hat and put on my counselor's hat. And he's someone who, when we had to fight off an application to strike out the claim. So I inherited the claim from a well-known firm of solicitors, big firm, who you see them advertised on TV. Won't name names. So I inherit this claim from them, and I inherit a strikeout application with the case. Now, most solicitors would run a mile. There's a risk that this claim will be struck out. Clearly, there's a breakdown with the solicitor. He doesn't have a solicitor. He's desperately searching for a solicitor. And I remember having I think it was my second COVID jab, on the way home in the taxi. Taxi driver asked me, "Are you a musician?" I said, "No, I am, but not a professional. I play guitar, but my day job is as a solicitor." Oh, my friend is looking for a solicitor. Fast forward, I then take the claim on. He's got this strikeout application. And one of the things I notice about this case, and this case is against the Ministry of Defence, is that the communication between him and his lawyers is fractured. The relationship has broken down. Now, in my view, I didn't think it had irretrievably broken down. But you can imagine a Jamaican so-called dreadlocks soldier has two white men, a white partner and senior associate dealing with him, pulling their hair out at the inability to communicate or get through to him. And at the application hearing, what I said to the judge in my witness statement is, I speak to him in Jamaican patois to be able to get certain things through to him. And the very, very sympathetic female circuit judge nodded. I would say that was more than sympathy. I would say that she nodded empathetically. And when I saw that nod, because there's a passage in my witness statement that says, I speak to him in Jamaican patois. I had given him sympathetic legal advice, or empathetic legal, but I use the word sympathetic. And we defeated the application. There were failings in the directions order, steps that hadn't been taken. And the defendant solicitors, the solicitors for the MOD, sought to strike it out. And one of the themes was he needed someone who could speak to him on that level. So empathy mixed with professionalism is really what is required in this job.
To be honest, it also speaks to the importance of representation, because, like I said, you could step into that void regardless of how good or bad your patois was. There was still a connection that could happen, which allowed him to feel a lot more comfortable to be able to share. You had a lot more cultural context, as opposed to him being represented by two potentially, and this may be stereotypical, white middle class lawyers who, for them, it's just a matter of frustration. It's like, oh, we can't deal with this, we're out. So even that speaks to that. But earlier on, you made that point around being professional, and I guess I'm curious, have you always been viewed as professional, even in the line of duty, i.e. you going to court and you're going to represent someone? Have you always been seen as a professional, or are you always seen as a black man first? My sister's also a lawyer, and now she's stopped. I remember we've had a number of these conversations where at times when she would turn up to court and she's had to, like, I'm actually meant to be here because they tried to send her somewhere else. So are you always viewed as professional? And if not, how do you then begin to change that, or do you even bother changing other people's perception around what professionalism looks like?
Maybe I'll give you one of my anecdotes, because there's so many of them. I many years ago represented a doctor, and when I say doctor, I mean a PhD doctor, health and safety expert, in a personal injury claim. This was a claim involving a go-karting accident. This claim went to trial at the High Court in the Strand. But before it went to trial, I'd spoken to him, and this was way back now, before you had profiles on websites and stuff like that. I mean, even now, I don't think my picture is on the firm's, my profile picture is not on the, I need to update it, but my profile picture is not on the firm's website even now. But back in the day, there was no way of identifying me online, because we weren't online back then. So, and we're talking, wow, 2001. So we're looking like good 21 years ago. So before this went to trial, I attended a conference with counsel down in Fleet Street at a set of chambers there, and the client was waiting for me in the reception area. So I dealt with him for about 18 months prior to actually physically meeting him. So it's all telephone and correspondence. So when I turned up at the conference, I signed in, and the receptionist said, Mr. Chan, your client is in the waiting room. So I approach him in the waiting room. He looks over his newspaper, sees me, looks around me, looks through me, probably glances at me, puts his head back down into his newspaper. And what I'm about to tell you is not embellished. Some people like to tell stories and add to make it more dramatic. There's nothing added, nothing taken away. This is what happened. So I approach and I say, I call him Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, Terrence Channer. Dr. Smith jumps up, startled, taken aback, amazed, and says, he issues the immortal words, verbatim, Terence, you never told me you were a black man. Now let that sink in. Let that sink in. You never told me you were a black man.
So I'm not you, and in my head already, there are a lot of thoughts that come up in the best way to respond, and none of them are coming from a good Christian soul right now. So I'm curious, like, what was in that moment in time? What were you thinking?
Okay, when something like that happens, you don't have the chance to respond, and sometimes it's good that you don't have a chance to respond, because your response might be the wrong one. So I carried on as if nothing happened. I shook his hand. I went into the conference, but there was it was a trigger. It was a trigger. It was a catalyst, and I don't think it was a catalyst for bad. I think it was a catalyst for good. What Dr. Smith had done, and we all do it. Let's be honest. We all do this. It's instinctive. It's intuitive. Is that when you speak to someone over the telephone, you begin to paint a picture. That is unavoidable. I am not going to criticize Dr. Smith from painting me as a white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, 6'2" white man. I'm not going to criticize him for that. And in fact, if Dr. Smith had not, and his name is not Dr. Smith, I'm going to call him Dr. Smith. If Dr. Smith had not disengaged his brain from his tongue, I would never know that that was what he was thinking. And I would not be able to tell you the story today. That story has so many positives. And I've not viewed it as a negative, because after that happened, Dr. Smith began to invite me to lunch, ring me up. I was a curiosity. Now, I know a lot of us will say, well, that's a negative. And in my view, you could see it as a negative, in that I became Dr. Smith's one and only black friend for that short period of time. But I've never viewed it as a negative, because I was glad that I was able to smash a stereotype so spectacularly of a white lawyer. So he had in his mind, white man, white lawyer. He'd read my correspondence. A white man has written this correspondence. He'd read my letters. He'd listened to me on the telephone, and he's speaking to a white man. Now, it's not a case of me acting like a white man. It's a case of English is my first language. I write in English. I speak in English. I'm a lawyer. I will speak like a lawyer. I'll speak like a black lawyer, I am just a lawyer. I'm speaking, a fireman goes into a fire and he fights the fire as a fireman. There isn't a black way to fight the fire or a white way to fight a fire. You just get the water and the foam and you firefight. There isn't a black way to firefight. Now, I know you might say, well, actually, there's difference in that, because, black people are supposed to speak with a certain tone. We're supposed to give it away, give the game away. Yes and no. I mean, your accent is your accent. And I have no criticism of Dr. Smith. I was happy to have smashed his stereotype of what a lawyer should look like. And I got invited to his male voice choir concert. He then shared his marital problems with me. It was an interesting episode, and so therefore the answer to the question is, which is, have I been viewed as a black man first and a lawyer Second, the answer is in that particular case, no, I was always viewed as a lawyer first until I pitched up with my black self and smashed the stereotype. And of course, when I go to court, when I go to court, I'm dressed as a lawyer. And therefore, when I turn up at the desk, what you normally get is, are you solicitor or counsel? There isn't, are you the client? I never get that. So when I go to a civil hearing, because I do civil litigation, I never get, are you the client? I've heard stories of and crime is different. When you do criminal defense work, I've heard stories where barristers, black barristers, female and male, have been asked whether they are a witness or whether they are the defendant, and that's unfortunate. But I don't do civil litigation, so I don't really come across that. So that one story, I think, probably sums up what you can imagine. I mean, nowadays, if I'm dealing with a solicitor on the other side for the defendant, they Google, my picture's going to come up straight away anyway. So, but yeah, I think I hope I've answered your question.
You have, and I think the way that you handle that situation, a lot of people will say that's a very magnanimous approach, because you didn't respond, you just leaned into the role that you were there to play, and like you said, you've gone on to be able to build a relationship with that person and build a bridge effectively, because shattering one stereotype, and obviously you got to know each other and everything else from then, is you felt the freedom to open up to you, so you built a bridge, which is good and is what you want naturally. But I guess the other side would then be, with so much anger, shall I say, and frustration that can build up, like, why would you have what is it that enabled you to be able to go to that side rather than to the, how dare you think like I was a white, blonde, blue-eyed guy, like, are you like, what is it about me? What, can't lawyers be black or something? Like, all that whole side of things, which, as you can imagine, a lot of people in particular, when you've had a lot of back and forth, a lot of frustrations, a lot of being seen a particular way all your life, then getting that in that building, it will be a trigger, and it will bring up an emotional anger response. So there's something that you did which was different, which I loved hearing about. So I guess I'm trying to find out, what is it that people can learn that enables them to go into that phase that you did, and recognizing every circumstance and situation is going to be different. There are times where you need to come with some anger and some fire, which you do online, and I know you do that in person as well. But what is it that allowed you to lean into that other side of things?
Because remember, I had the opportunity to make a meal of it. Maybe that's a wrong phrase to use, in fact, but I had the opportunity to feel aggrieved about that. But I think, in all honesty, when dealing with situations of race and racism and prejudice and stereotypes, racial stereotypes, we have to do a couple of things. I think the first thing is to decide whether, is this a battle that I need right now? Not every battle you're going to don your armor and fight. It's not every battle you need to fight. So the first question is this a battle that I need to fight? And that should also dictate your levels of disquiet and anger as well, because I took the view that in this case, Dr. Smith had genuinely, and we all do it, genuinely thought that a black person would sound a certain way over the telephone. not thinking that he was ever speaking to a black person, a black man. So he genuinely had an idea what a doctor or a lawyer should look like. My job was done the moment I said, Dr. Smith, Terrence Channer. My job's done. My job is done. There's no more battles to fight there. Once he said to me, I didn't think you were a black man. Now that, to me, I didn't find insulting. I felt that was a disengagement of brain and tongue. That, in fact, I'm glad he'd said that, because it helped me to know. If he hadn't said that, I wouldn't know that he had a stereotype in his mind's eye, as to what a lawyer should look like. So when that happened, and I blew apart his stereotype, not by complaining, not by responding, how dare you. My job was done. He had this stereotype. It had been spectacularly dismantled to the point that he couldn't even prevent himself from saying those words. My job was done. And in fact, I never set out to do that job. That was never my intention. Wasn't, oh, I bet he doesn't think I'm a... it wasn't like, oh, should I mention I'm black? It was never a case of, maybe I should tell him I'm a black person before the meeting, just to warn him. That never occurred to me. Exactly.
Why would it? You wouldn't think about that.
There's no need.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't even like it was a job I had to do. You could say it was fortuitous. It simply happened. And I've never viewed it as a negative, although in a grander scheme of things, when you look across the board with a wider perspective as to representation, then of course there is a negative there that has to be rooted out, which is, what does a doctor or a lawyer look like? And if the general population believes that a doctor or a lawyer should look like a white person, preferably a white man, then of course we have a problem of representation. But in this particular case, Dr. Wilhoft walked away thinking, my lawyer's black man, he's doing a good job. So as far as I was concerned, if you're looking at case-by-case basis, which is not about case-by-case basis, it's about across the board. But on this individual case basis, bam, job done. Job done.
What would you like to see happen when it comes to the police, brutality, racism, the different areas that you step into as a lawyer? What would you like to see happen?
The first thing I'd like to see happen is the obvious, but it's a case of how do we get there, and it's this. It's impartial, unbiased policing. So policing where the intelligence-led policing is not racially biased. So we have a real issue with stop and search. It's been historic. Since the 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act, we've got records of stop and searches where they have to complete a slip. And those statistics that we rely on are police statistics. So their own statistics are condemning them. So what the police have to then do is explain why, and Cressida Dick sought to explain that in 2020 when Yvonne Fletcher at the Home Affairs Select Committee asked her about the 80,000 stop and searches of young black men in London in 3 months between March and May. And she said, well, Yvonne Cooper asked her, I said Fletcher, no, I meant Cooper, Yvonne Cooper, sorry, my mistake. Yvonne Cooper said, "Are you not alarmed?" And Cressida Dick, the former commissioner, said, "I am not alarmed, I'm alert." Doubling down on the police's racist stop and search by effectively saying that we are alert to black people who are criminals, who are rightfully suspected. Let me rephrase that. Black people who are rightfully, young black men who are rightfully under suspicion because of knife crime or whatnot. And when you draw down and you look at, in fact, why they are stopping black young men, the great preponderance of those stop and searches relate to a smell of cannabis. Smell of cannabis. We know the pretext. We know in many of these cases you have not smelt cannabis. We know that we can't prove you did not smell cannabis. That's why it is the most effective ruse, the most effective pretext for a stop and search, as with Child Q, is a smell of cannabis. Now, of course, Child Q was not stopped and searched. She was already in school, and she experienced a horrific, humiliating stop and search on the basis that the teachers could smell cannabis. So what I would like to see is prohibiting stop and search on the basis of the smell of cannabis. Now, I know that the police, certainly the police watchdog, has said, look, there has to be more than just a smell of cannabis. Now, some of the reasons are outrageous. I've got a case at the moment whereby I'm representing, in fact, a lawyer. I'm not going to go any further than that. I'm being careful with my words, in fact, here. And when you look at the reason for the stop and search, and in fact, it was just a stop in that case, was that you were paying too much attention to us. You're driving an expensive car that are often stolen. And your name is very common. And when we did a search on that very, very common name that obviously I can't mention, we got a hit for a disqualified driver. And that was a top hit. And I looked at the reasons and I thought, my Lord, these reasons are so ridiculous. They're unreasonable. If I am looking at a police officer, it means the police officer is looking at me if he's noticed. So why are you looking at me? It's a joke. If you allege that I've looked at you, which again isn't a crime, and shouldn't be, it's not. It's not suspicious, rather. Sorry, forget my reference to crime. It's not suspicious for me to look at you. When I'm going about my daily business and I see the police, I am looking because you're a police officer and I want to know what you're up to. If you're fighting crime, I'm curious. Why wouldn't any member of the public be curious of seeing the police in action? We should pay attention to our police officers and our fire officers and firemen and paramedics. When a paramedic or an ambulance, or a paramedic rider or an ambulance is stopped, I'm having a good look. Call me nosy. I'm like most members of the public. If the police stop outside my house or they stop down my street, I want to know what is there going to be some action? I want to see what's going on. I want, like most members of the public. So to suggest it is suspicious, and this is what the police said in the case of the Sunday school student, young black man, who I settled his case in May, one of the reasons for his stop was he looked at us. Can you believe it? If you're a black person, you better not look at the police. And then if you don't look at the police, it will be, very odd that you should not pay attention to the police. That's what people do. So how is it that you looked away when you saw us? It's walking on the cracks type grounds. He walked on the cracks in the pavement, therefore under the old sus law. That's very suspicious. It's outrageous. And then to say you're driving an expensive vehicle and expensive vehicles get stolen is outrageous. 99.99% of expensive vehicles on the road are not stolen. So what made you think that this one might be? So when you add all the reasons together, and what makes you think that a name like John Smith is not going to be at the top for a disqualified driver? 99.9% of the John Smiths in the police national computer are not disqualified. So why have the bias, the racial bias, that one, he's looking at me suspiciously, two, it's an expensive car, and three, John Smith's a disqualified driver and you've got the same name as John Smith. Well, what about the other 99.9% of drivers with the name of John Smith who are not disqualified? So it's this kind of nonsense that we need the police to actually stop. It's racist. The pretext of a smell of cannabis is, I mean, I'll have to have a look at what the position is in the United States, the states that have legalized cannabis. What rules the police have, because if you no longer have the smell of cannabis because it's been legalized, what then do they use? And I know all the high-profile cases relate to, Patrick LaLawyer and some of the other cases are to do with traffic or suspected traffic violations. So, sorry if I've taken too long in answer your question. My answer is I want to see an end to racist stop and search, because race stop and search is usually the catalyst for death in police custody. We've got George Floyd, a stop, an arrest. Dalian Atkinson, we have police being called. It wasn't a stop and search, but it was police being called out to somebody who had mental health problems, whose life was lost at the boot of a police officer. So I want to see if we can see unbiased stop and search. It means that the black community is there no longer over police, certainly on stop and search is the most traumatic, blunt tool that's being used to smash the black community, stop and search. So I think the reason why there's so much focus on stop and search, because stop and search is the greatest interaction between the police and the black community, is stop and search. I want to see a reduction. I want to see the whole race of search. Certainly, I'll start with a significant reduction in that, and then for it to be eliminated. But it's going to take a hell of a lot. Certainly, the pretext of the smell of cannabis needs to be removed. That armor, that is a powerful tool. If I can smell cannabis tool, it's extremely powerful. So in my case, this is typical. A lot of black men have been stopped on suspicion of drug dealing. They looked at us. They're in an area well known for drugs. So the case that settled the other day, it wasn't one of my cases. The claim received was a guardian. He received £30,000. He was in the park eating a sandwich whilst walking his dog. And that's a funny case. In that case, he was violently stopped and searched and he recovered £30,000 from the Metropolitan Police. And in that case, the duty sergeant, check this out, the duty sergeant who you expected to support the officer in question said, "Oh wow, let's call him Officer PC Plod. Oh well, PC Plod had a habit of not doing much during the day, but during his lunch break, he'd do a stop and search, and come back with a stop and search slip, and not do anything for the rest of the day. So he'd do his stop and searches at lunchtime. He had a very poor work ethic. So here's an officer. Here is an officer. Sorry, it's not even funny. It's not. Edit that laughter out because it's not even funny, right? But it is funny. Here's an officer, yeah? An officer who is a lazy git, yeah? Excuse my language. Who decides that the best time of the day to show that he's busy is lunchtime. Stop a black guy, stop a youth, and come back, stop and search slip. And the IOPC said in that case the grounds for the stop were just not sufficient. They were not good grounds for the stop. He would cut £30,000, and what is disgraceful, and I'll send you the case so you can read it, is that the internal police disciplinary proceedings gave me all clear. Gave this officer, there were no misconduct findings as far as I could see in the report. Gave this officer effectively whitewashed the case. So this officer is, as far as I can tell, is still on the beat, probably still going out at lunchtime. In fact, I actually think probably he's changed his behaviour because of the criticism. But he may still be going out at lunchtime, picking up a young black man. Oh, there's a young black man. Oh, let me stop and search him. And in that case, the trauma. I'll send you the case. But the trauma after all the years, because that occurred 2 years ago. But the trauma of that young man is untold. It's just trauma. We're talking we're not talking about just a normal standard stop. We're talking a very violent stop and search. It's the I can't breathe type stop and search. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. It's that bad. Trauma time. And this is happening to predominantly young black men up and down the country. It's not one.
It's been interesting listening to you talk and share some of the experiences, and it's also been as painful in a sense as it is. It's also good to hear that there are people like yourselves who are in those positions, who are basically fighting the system to ensure that there is a more equitable and just system in place for people, generally speaking, but for black people as well that you're working with. Because I think what happens a lot of times is that example you gave earlier on, even with the Jamaican man, where cases like that can easily just get discarded or washed away or not looked into. What it needed or what it took was from someone who saw the person as a person rather than an inconvenience to be able to lead in and do something. And a lot of times that's probably one of the biggest areas, is you just want to be seen, you want to be heard, you want someone to take you and your case seriously. And that doesn't always happen due to a lot of cultural barriers sometimes. So you being in that space to be able to fill that gap, and as well as the work you do, like I said, you can check out his writing on The Voice, you can check out Terrence's writing on LinkedIn. He busts his joke and he comes with a realness at the same time, so you always get that equilibrium, which I absolutely love, and he does not hold back like he hasn't done today. But you being in that space for me is just good to hear, and that's one of the reasons why I really just wanted you to come on and just to share a bit more about who you are, what you do, how you show up, how you make that difference. Because I think sometimes it's hard to think there's no one in that space at all, to think it's just bad and bad and bad and bad and bad. And yes, it's a massive space. The legal system is ridiculously huge, and there's still a lot of issues as we talked about today, but it still feels good to know that there are people doing something, and there are people fighting and trying to create that difference and that change. So thank you for sharing your story, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on the show. There are challenges that lie ahead. The current government, as we all know, is seeking to neuter and water down the rights under the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act. They're seeking to lessen the effectiveness of the legislation.
This is Everyday Leadership. How you can find out more around Terence and the work he does, and to get hold of him, all of that will be in the show notes. And I will see you next week. But I hope you've enjoyed today's episode as much as I have, because I just enjoyed just being to sit back and listen to some of those amazing stories that Terence shared, which I absolutely appreciate. See you next week, folks.